Berdin Desari was practically vibrating as Tom scanned the foot traffic leaving exit terminal 378. Races of all sorts dotted the mostly shil'vati crowd, and Berdin was craning his neck as best he could to spot his family. Funnily enough, it was Tom who spotted them first. Maybe it was the knot of humans in the group, though it was probably his friend's extra height. He followed Tom's gaze when his friend nodded up the causeway. Is that them? It took a moment for a knot of Tory to amble out of the way before he saw them, and his heart fluttered in his chest. Oh my, yes! The flutter settled, bathed in a warm glow of satisfaction. Phrysis had put on weight. The poor dear still looked much herself, and was shepherding her co-wives, poor Brelak, and a host of others along in her wake. Her business suit was a bit bedraggled, doubtless from all the strain. Berdin felt his spirits rise, and he waved delicately as he stepped out to catch their eye. Akatai glanced his way, said something to Miara, and moments later they began heading in his direction. Thankfully, Tom had the connections to get a sizable transport. Malondi was over with Vadim, and his son watched uncertainly. They had poor Solani to consider, but there were plenty of women to manage. Not that Phrysis ever minded organising. The stars would go out before... "Oh, you poor dears! Welcome home!" Berdin reached out to embrace Brelak fondly before stepping back. There was a small throng of children gathered about, and he gave them all a welcoming smile as he took inventory. Tom was exchanging nods with the eldest human male in Phrysis' group, but there simply wasn't time to watch how they greeted one another in the wild. Trixis and Solana had certainly grown, and Riala hovered protectively close to a human man and woman, each of whom held a small child in their arms. That made the young man near her Jassarin, and he had grown up into a fine... "Oh dear. Well, there's no accounting for taste out in the colonies. Shopping later." There was always time for shopping, and with luck he might get Tom to come. Clothing aside, they all looked quite well, and he braced himself as Phrysis made her way over, allowing himself to be briefly embraced. "Cousin, it's so good to be home." Phrysis stood back and looked him over briefly, before taking in the group. "And this must be Vadim." "Introductions later. You must all be perfectly exhausted, and we simply must get you home." Berdin straightened his jacket. It was taffeta, after all, though Brelak looked tired and wouldn't judge. Still, when one was out in public, the public eye. "We've substantial transportation arranged, with Miss Tonnis here to help drive us home." "Of course, and it's good to see you employing the disabled." Phrysis stepped over to give Solani an approving nod. "It's a pleasure to meet you. It's such a relief to see a woman looking after my cousin. Men of his age need someone about. And are you a veteran too? That's exactly the sort of thing my administration takes care of back on Earth. I'm sure Miara will have 100 questions for you, and perhaps something can be done to get you a reliable prosthetic." "Of my age? You Torox!" Any burgeoning desire to scratch her eyes out was cast aside as Phrysis turned back. "Oh, and you brought a girl to help. That's thoughtful. The girls and I have been trying to take care of Brelak, but it was such a tiring trip." Berdin watched as Phrysis Desari, his beloved cousin, and scion of House Desari, unceremoniously dropped her carry-on bag into Melondi's arms with barely a glance. "Thank you, young lady." There were moments when the universe held its breath, when the goddess looked down upon the affairs of mortals to intervene. Berdin watched his son's eyes go wide as Princess Kalira Tassu, heiress to the Duchy of Varkif and the Eastern Palace, opened her mouth, then closed it again, shouldering the bag. Phrysis was already in her element. "Come on, everyone! The baggage carousel should be just this way." Every so often, the goddess was kind. The universe let the matter go, and Berdin remembered to breathe. He closed ranks with Brelak, and the entire throng of his family clan began moving. He managed at least a dozen steps in his cousin's wake when the loudspeaker sounded over the terminal. Gentlemen and ladies, your attention please. All terminal traffic will shut down in 3 hours to clear local airspace for priority arrival. The report has just arrived from Space Traffic Control. Home fleet has returned. Terminal 250 through 400 will be cleared for personal transfer and resupply. Please conclude your business. Alternate landing for inbound cargo will be posted. Thank you for your cooperation. Budin glimpsed the expression on Melondi's face. The goddess had a sense of humour, but it wasn't always kind. Levi took a deep breath, adjusted Joshua's weight in his arms, and tried to relax as the family began moving through the massive starport. It wasn't the size of the crowd that set alarm bells ringing in the back of his head, though he was certainly no fan of crowds. It wasn't even how many of them were staring. That was just a thing shil'vati did. No, most of them were staring at Josh and Cassie. He glanced over at the girl nestled in Melody's arms, just in time to watch a pair of grey-skinned humanoids with horns and glowing lines crisscrossing their exposed skin as they walked past. They stared, wide-eyed at the infant, and then turned and began jabbering excitedly in a language he didn't understand, looking back all the while. Easy, dude. Let's bring the paranoia down a notch or two, Phrysis was in rare form this morning, issuing instructions and treading on proverbial toes with all the blustering self-assuredness she'd had when he'd first met her. Budin, the cousin who was here to pick them all up, had looked homicidal for a moment during the conversation between Phrysis and the rather military-looking woman with one arm. The human, who'd introduced himself to Zachariah as Tom Warwick, wore a long-suffering expression accented by the occasional wince. Even the girl she dumped her bag on seemed utterly flabbergasted before making a quick recovery. Speaking of which... Hey, bud. He addressed the boy in his arms as they approached the baggage carousel. I need you to go to Mama Ree for me, okay? Joshua nodded and Levi handed him off to his shil'vati wife, who immediately began pointing out cool stuff to him. The two were soon engrossed in the holographic advertisements that floated near the room's ceiling. Mentally shifting gears, Levi walked over to where the young lady was holding Phrysis' bag with a bemused expression. Pardon me. He stifled a wince at the thickly accented Vatica coming out of his mouth, but soldiered on. I wanted to say sorry for Lady Dasari. She means well, but is... well, she is a noble. He held out a hand. I can take it if you like. The girl blinked in surprise, then waved dismissively. No, it's fine. I was just surprised. But thank you for the offer, Mr. I am Levi. He turned and waved a hand at the girls. Those are my wives, Melody and Riala. And thank you, Your Grace. The girl stumbled. What? Sorry. Thank you for Your Grace. Levi gave her an apologetic grimace. Sorry, I'm learning still much of the language. Thank you for, being graceful? Being kind about the mother of my wife. Oh, I understand. She gave a quiet laugh and a shake of her head. My name is Melondi. You said Levi, Riala, and Melody, right? You said they're both your wives? I did. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. I'm afraid that I'm not looking for a third co, if that is what you really wanted to know. Melondi gave a polite snort of laughter. Does that come up often? All the time. I think it is more candid to say it up front. No need to worry about me, Levi, she assured him with a smile. May I ask about your little ones? The bigger one is Joshua, and the discount one is Cassandra. How old are they? They look small. 4 and 2. That would be a little over 1 and 2 in shil'vati years. But they're so tiny. Shil'vati women are big. They make big babies. Human women are small. They make small babies. The rumble of the luggage conveyor drew his attention. Levi shrugged and gave her a rueful grin. "But please excuse me while I grab my bag. I'm pleased to meeting you." The Dasari women were already pulling the suitcases and bags off of the carousel, as it homed in on the signals from their omnipads. Levi ignored the looks from other passengers as he slipped through the crowd, snagging the bags of his wives and children. In short order, he had a duffel bag slung over each shoulder, a suitcase in each hand, and was plodding back toward his family. Riala laughed as he lumbered up. "All in one trip?" "Always." Melody nodded back the way he'd come from. "You made quite an impression for yourself back there." Turning to look over his shoulder, he stifled a groan. There were easily 24 shil'vati, a couple of bug things, and something that looked for all the world like a naga, all staring at him with wide eyes. They hastily looked away, with expressions ranging from chagrin to blue-faced embarrassment. And here I was, thinking the staff of the Starliner were thirsty. Melody shrugged. "Well, you are something of a rarity, sweetie." "What do you mean?" "Look around. There are more men here with us, in our group, than I've seen since we left Earth." Melody gave an artful shrug of her shoulders, but it was her bemused smile that told him he'd missed the broad side of the barn. "And you should have let us get all the bags." Levi rested one of the duffels against an ornate bronze trash bin, and turned, scanning the bustling concourse with a growing sense of astonishment. Apart from the species that were utterly unrecognizable to him, he counted a grand total of 3 men. 2 shil'vati males, both with a bevy of vigilant women around them, and a Rakiri who looked like he could go toe-to-toe with the Hulk for at least 30 seconds. A moment later, the cylinder slid away and rotated, a filmy red eye peering out at him through a slit in the top. Levi let back an alarm as it burbled something at him harshly, then turned and trundled toward the exit. "We're definitely not in Kansas anymore." Jama sighed as he looked over the reports on Earth. It was disheartening, after so long a road to reach this point, but the partisans springing up around Denver needed to be taught a lesson. He had seen this behavior before. Left unchecked, resistance fighters would start springing up in the midwestern part of the continent, creating a domino effect throughout the territory. The clear move was to use the Marines to ferret them out. It was disappointing, but there were few alternatives. He looked at the report again and shrugged. The locals didn't stand a chance, and crushing the resistance was for the best. He looked at the screen and typed in a few notes that he thought would prove useful in quelling the natives later. Ideally, the local population would fall in line, as long as things were handled quickly, and there wouldn't need to be unrest through North America. It wasn't as if there were long odds against the Marines on station, and it would be better to keep the situation contained and away from the continent at large. "Not that partisans ever saw sense. The useless buggers would try and spread, though. There was a home front advantage, and the unrest will rise like the tide. No mistake about that." He's seen it before, and there was no doubt this would be the same. It was a question of keeping things proportional. You let things get out of hand, and sentiment everywhere would shift across the planet. At least there was no call for nuclear weapons. Not yet, anyway. And he jotted down a terse notation in his omnipad. Allowing partisans to spread was how the scenario spiraled out of control, and before you knew it, sentiment changed, and relations were ruined. Should that happen, as distasteful as it was, nuclear weapons might be an option. Until then, there was no call for anything more overt. A simple, decisive decapitation strike would pacify the... An alert chime sounded on his omnipad, and Jama closed his notes and swiped open the alert. Reading through the notice, he paused in thought. Home Fleet was back in the system. Shil was rejoicing, and the palace has scheduled an announcement for 7 p.m, capital time. Jama spared a thought for what it all might mean. The Empress would need time to make an announcement, and she was a decent soul. The return of the Home Fleet would bring a close to this sad chapter in everyone's lives. Her Imperial Majesty would honour her daughter with a state funeral, of course, then life would go on. Her Highness, Princess Kalandri, the once and future Empress, would be sealed into a golden pod and sent to her final rest in Sham's embrace. One with the sunlight, she would shine down on Shil along with her ancestors, sanctified in the embrace of the star itself. And, of course, the period of mourning would be over. Just as well that old Rada had reached out to ask him for an appraisal, it offered a perfect excuse to show Tom a proper night out. Trade at the Typol will be brisk, with everyone wanting an ease up. It was quite a fair trade, as Warwick's arrival had provided invaluable insights into pre-collapse civilizations. Who would have thought the lad would adapt so readily, though? He was proving to be a handful for young Miv, but she was a sensible lass. After all that had happened, it was remarkable to find Tom was a good friend. Now he could return the favour by showing the lad a home world that was no longer in mourning. After setting an alarm to watch the announcement, Jama set his pad down and reopened the other file. He studied the report once more, with a dour sense of the tragedy that would surely unfold. So many lives sacrificed, but it would be for the greater good. Still, treason's treason, no matter how you shape it. That was the thing about revolt that anyone from Sevastopol or Cambria could tell you. There was no excuse. Nothing that would mitigate the dishonour of a vassal rising against the lawful order. There were no mitigating circumstances against rebellion against the sovereign. Unless you win. Jama looked at the information and shook his head. The Marines would crush any resistance before it could spread. There would be no revolt in Denver. Only a senseless waste of human life. Hold on to 16, as long as you can. Changes come around real soon, mixes women and men. John Cougar Mellencamp's voice rolled through Tom's thoughts as the bus made its way through the capital, and he considered the crowd around him in the privacy of his thoughts, watching Melondi. The city changed around them on their drive toward Miver's home. The tall mega-scrapers that had worn muted colours during the time of mourning were lighting up again, vibrant golds and purples and reds streaking up their sides, illuminating the skyline as the news spread. Melondi was somewhere around 19 in Earth years, but it wasn't the years, it was the experience that made a difference. He thought back to the young woman he'd met before he'd ever conceived she might be an Imperial princess. Melondi had the bloom of youth about her. Not innocent and experimenting, she was still more polished than people her age usually were. Given her classmates, that was saying something. The girl had a certainty about her that didn't come easily. A resolution to her character that, truth be told, reminded Tom of everything said about her mother, the Empress. In the beginning, he'd been a little in awe of his new circumstances and trying to adjust, but his class had made an impression. The girls were special, every one of them, but thankfully human studies had been a group of 12. Rather than the large auditorium that was marriage fundamentals, he'd come to know his students as people. There was plenty of give and take to Melondi. She stood by her friends, seemed to love Vadim without reservation for his station, and pursued life with a vigour undaunted by the weight on her shoulders. Tom studied her as she whispered something to Vadim, and wondered what she was feeling now. It was easier to ponder her feelings than to explore his own. How many humans had he seen since he'd been on Shil? 3, and never together. In fairness, he hadn't been all that social before leaving Earth, but this was different. Now, for the first time in months, there were 8, all experiencing Shil for the first time. The 2 infants didn't count. The young ones, Cassandra and Joshua, were holding on to their parents with all the certainty in the world that whatever was strange, that Mum and Dad, and Mum, would make it safe. He'd known from Badine that Levi McClendon was married to his cousin's co-daughter. That was part of how human food had gotten started, though Badine sometimes got sketchy on the details. It was nice to see the reality, though. Levi and his wives, and the way Joshua was hanging on to something? Riella? One more thing to remember, besides not saying Mel when those two are in the same room. Melody and Melondi. humans and shil'vati. Levi's younger brother, Eli, looked out the window now and then while talking to his sister, Hannah, and tried not to look too impressed. Hannah didn't share his reservations. Sitting in the row behind Melondi, she'd been asked questions as they drove through the city and seemed to be having a good time. Despite everything that must be on her mind, Melondi had answered every question thoughtfully, at least when Hannah's brother's wife's co-mother wasn't taking over the conversation. Frances looked like she was in her element and enjoying every minute of it. Not that Tom could blame her. The Dasari clan seemed to be made up of its matriarch, Frances, along with her co-wives, Akita, Nixie, and Miara. The three of them were watching over their husband, Brelak, who was deep in a quiet yet animated conversation with Badin. As for Frances, she seemed to thrive on doing something all the time, and watching her supervise the bus had been interesting. Thankfully, Solani seemed to be getting on with Miara, and weathered it all with good grace. Riala, that was it, was sitting with Levi, while the other Dasaris looked outside as the vast spaceport fell away and the capital slowly surrounded them. Solana and Trixis were looking outside with an easy manner, while the youngest girl, Yumi, sighed and watched over their younger brother, a boy named Lagos. The kicker was the older boy, Jasarin. He was around Vadim's age. Hell of a thing seeing a shil'vati guy wear a flannel shirt and faded blue jeans like a second skin. I thought Badim was going to faint. As for the oldest McClendons, it was hard to tell. He traded a few cautious words with Zachariah and his wife, who told him to call her Jen moments before Francis began herding them all out to the terminal. Despite feeling hustled, he actually felt some envy towards the shil'vati matriarch. I tried to wrap up Earth like a present for Miv. How would I feel taking her back along with Leia, Solani, Desi, Leah's mothers, and maybe half my class? Jax would be glued to the window, and Lark would be taking pictures of everything. Desi would be filing everything away she saw to ask me later, while Desala would be trying to play it cool. Leia's mothers would probably be asking me about nude beaches. I can't exactly blame the women for being proud and wanting to share it all. The youngest had probably never left Earth. Mind you, it had been hard not to laugh when they'd driven through the government center. "Just think, children, the Empress is back!" Francis exclaimed as they passed the assembly of noble houses. "We may even see an appearance by one of the royal family." Tom bit his lip and watched Melondi, whose smile became a bit glazed. He could laugh himself sick later on. Besides, they'd arrived. Prelatori was a nice district. Off in its commercial area, Human Food was one of many upmarket, quirky shops that catered to clients from all over the quarter. Huddled along the coast, it was one of those towns that was wealthy without being rich. Affluent, yes, but it was a Petotsky rather than a Cape Cod. Picturesque, the houses dotting the coast were lovely without being the super mansions of the shil'vati elite, and despite all the difficulties to what was left of House Pelavon, Miv's home with Shalea had been the one thing she'd fought to hold on to. Now, after inheriting a substantial sum, the cottage was back to its full glory. "Why, Bodine, this is just lovely!" Francis exclaimed. "But I thought we were dropping off the children first." "We are, dear. Mr. Warwick and his wives have been kind enough to lend us his home for the duration of your stay." 2 seats ahead, Bodin didn't quite inflate, but he still looked pleased in profile. "That way dear Brelak will have a room to himself, with one set aside for the McClendons, one for Nixie and Miara, and another for you and Akatai. His fiancée, Miss Solani, is staying with them for her recovery," he added, a bit tartly. Tom watched the woman flounder for a moment, but she recovered a lot faster than he'd expected. Solani managed to look more flustered at being called his fiancé than being labelled a disabled veteran, but for all her bluster, her thanks seemed genuine. Not that she wasn't off and supervising the kids unloading the bags moments later. Zachariah caught Tom's eye with a look and arched a questioning eyebrow, while his wife gave him a warm but thoughtful smile. Tom smiled back at the pair of them and gave a little "it's all fine" shrug of his shoulders. And it was, as long as the kids didn't destroy the place. As his source for coffee and ham, he owed them much. Hot damn! A place on the beach? Eli mussed Hannah's hair on his way to the door, forgetting to look bored for a moment. This is going to be great. Levi, the older brother, was up and gave Tom a quiet nod. At his side, Melody wore a demure smile, while Riala was beaming. The trio busy organising their children, in the way parents always were. It wouldn't do to barge in, but Miv might want to meet them. She'd always wanted children in the house. No, this will be all right. Well, I can hardly wait to see where we're staying, cousin. Akito and I will be wonderful bunkmates, Phrysis offered crisply. I'm sure it will be so wonderfully cozy. Tom watched as Badin turned to the window with a dismissive "Shit." God damn. I swear I can see his blood pressure rising from here. The only public compartment on the ship with real space was the gym. Liam stretched out fully, under the watchful gaze of Belder and Pris. It had taken some coaxing to get the story out of Pris about what had put her into such a funk, but when she told them both, well, he'd never really seen Belle pissed off before, and truth be told he was a little irate himself. But Belle? She'd spent a good 20 minutes using language he'd never heard from her. Some of it wasn't even in Vatican, but Liam was pretty sure he got the gist just fine. Getting them all out of the stateroom had been a good idea. It had been 2 days together, and he needed the room. A trip offshore with his... well, Belle was his girl and he wanted to marry her, but 2 days into the trip, and she already wanted him to have a girlfriend? What the hell would he tell Hope when he got back? That was the neat thing about shil'vati women. They didn't fool around. Pris and Belle were friends from pretty different worlds, but they both wore their hearts on their sleeves. Pris had more filters than Belle. After listening to her cuss for 15 minutes, he was pretty sure she had a lot more, but that was nice too. You knew exactly where you stood. Growing up on Earth with Tyler, there hadn't been a lot of that. Not that he hadn't understood. Maybe not at first, but eventually he caught on. Hope hadn't had any more choice about leaving than he'd had about staying. Not that it made staying with Tyler any easier. He'd always been stuck in the past, worrying on one hand or judging him on the other. He'd done the best he'd known how, but it hadn't been easy for either of them. Tyler had gone ballistic at his choice to go live with Hope, and things had gotten ugly, fast. In the end, he hadn't been able to get out of there fast enough. It was easy to feel comfortable with Belle, and as it turned out, it was just as easy to be around Pris. He didn't find himself worrying about them saying one thing and thinking something else. It was kind of like dealing with a Marine back home, but in a nice way. Sure, you knew what was on their mind, and maybe it was because he settled so easily into the boyfriend zone with Belle, but Pris wasn't making it weird. She was expectant, sure, but it was like they were a pod of two. He didn't feel like he was being fought over, or judged. That was pretty chill. Coming to Shill had been a real change. He steered clear of Hope's students, but everywhere he'd run into shil'vati or the Rakiri at the club, they'd been no worse than people back home. Okay, the fight in the bar had been less than great, but again, not so bad. Belder had his back, and not just a little bit. She was there, all in, all the way. And Pris? Well, Pris gave him the same vibe. He looked to the pair as they chatted together, watching him while he limbered up. And yeah, it's confusing, but face it, they'd never abandon you. And if they were confusing, it wasn't because they were messing with your head. It was just easy to be with people who didn't always have their guard up. It had taken him a lot of growing up to get past Tyler, mostly thanks to his friends. They'd always been pretty easy, and Tyler really hadn't. It seemed like the older generation always felt the need to protect themselves. It was like that for a lot of people after the shil'vati came. But always keeping your guard up wasn't any way to live. It was kind of why he'd never been comfortable with human girls. There always seemed to be some hidden agenda. Maybe Tyler was right about some of it, but he always took things way too far. There was a point where you went from being careful to being so hurt that you stopped letting anyone in. That wasn't what he wanted. Tyler had always tried to be in control. It was all a lie, and he'd been a miserable bastard whenever he ran into something he couldn't. The older Liam had gotten, the more that something had been him. Belle and Pris weren't afraid of being open, of being vulnerable. Sure, Pris had literally tried to hide herself away, but she'd opened up just as fast when they talked. Belle was probably right to push me out of the cabin to find her too. In their own ways, both of them showed they liked him, and neither of them had been afraid to ask for help. They'd shown they trusted him. Belle had already clearly invested herself in him, and once he said yes, she doubled down. He didn't feel strangled. It was just like there was no bullshit about it, and it felt like Pris wanted the same thing. Pris was a lot more exuberant than Belle, or at least blushed less. She didn't have any social anxiety. After his talk with her, it was pretty clear she really didn't care what other people thought. She cared a lot about what he thought. That was pretty chill too. The more he saw of her, the more he saw why she and Belle were such good friends. Show some people a door and they'd wonder if you were going to shut it in their faces. Belle walked right through, but she also held it open for Pris. Anyway, it had gotten him out of their stateroom. With nothing much to do besides watch videos, he barely wanted the exercise. And it turned out Pris didn't know how to dance. Well, that wouldn't fly. But instead of the battle he expected in offering to teach her, she jumped at the chance. Of course, his kind of dancing needed room, and there was the gym. He almost finished stretching when a whistle came from the corridor. It was Haura, the crewwoman that had been giving Pris such a load of shit. "Looking good there." Hauke was leaning in the doorway and licking her tongue across her lips suggestively. "Got room for one more, handsome?" "No, I really don't." The words were on his lips and he'd meant to say them. It was just that Belder got there first. "Listen up, Tips for Brains. You can get your miserable, skanky ass out of here and shove it back in the tail end of this barge with the rest of the crap." Belle growled as she crossed the room, raising her fist. "You even think about laying a hand on Liam, and I swear to the goddess that—" "Belle, you're a lady." Pris pursed her lips and sighed, laying a hand on Belle's fist. "Remember your ABCs? Always be clear. Always be classy. Always be concise. Birchie, I mean it. The ABCs are for everyone. Clear, classy, and concise." Pris looked from Belle to the engineer, and her voice became colder than space. "Fuck off, bitch." Tom Steinberg sat in his man cave, working on a pet project of his. Well, everyone called it the office, but it was a man cave, damn it. The work wasn't anything particularly malicious, just some blackmail should he run across members of the nobility he particularly disliked. In this case, though, it was a little more close to home. There were a couple of lunatics he paid to go obtain information from sources, and currently he was looking in on the head of the shill equivalent of the Homeowners Association of Prelentori, of which his neighbourhood was one part. It wasn't Tom's business to ask whether the lunatics hung the HOA's people over the side of buildings, or tickled them with a feather till they promised to behave, but HOAs just pissed him off. After the last few times they charged him for really stupid shit, he decided it was war. Oftentimes, just gathering information to gather more information required blackmail all its own. And thus, Tom was currently watching some footage of the HOA president, specifically what she'd done with a hooker he'd hired just for this purpose. Mind you, she'd paid for the hooker with appropriated HOA funds. She deserved what she got. And as for what she'd done to earn his ire, well, she hadn't exactly badmouthed survivors of the liberation, or legislated in favour of male trafficking, but Well, she just had the most punchable face on the HOA, and Tom intensely disliked her. When you were a spy, you were allowed to do that. Playing politics was a fun hobby. Lucrative, too. Anyways, Tom sipped his blood wine. Not the Pezrin stuff, that would melt your insides, chuckling at the lewd display in front of him. "Got you," he grumbled, watching the depravity of the villa on Palm Miandoir. "Tom?" If Tom's desk hadn't been facing the door, he would have been in deep shit, and having to explain that, no, he wasn't watching porn. This was work stuff. "Yeah? What's up?" There stood Avi, radiant as ever, especially with the baby on the way. Behind her was a Pezrin? "Can I help you?" he asked. Tom wasn't averse to Pezrin. His experiences generally left him quite fond of them. Still, one of the furry nopes standing in your office was never a good sign. "Hi," the girl said brightly. "I'm Raikishi of the Natasha. Remember me?" Yeah. Raikishi of the Natasha. Sure," Tom answered wearily. She still hadn't explained what she was doing here. "Did you need something?" he added. "She just knocked on the door," Avi confessed. Okay, that was odd. If a Pezrin wanted something, they didn't usually bother with politeness. As a species, the Pezrin were more kick the door down and take it types. "Yeah, we met the other night. You drove my sister home." Without a word, Raikishi slipped behind Tom's desk and peered at his work. She must have pegged what he was doing, because she gave him a quick, "nice," before hopping down into the other chair. "So, you know she needs to get her shit together?" A quick kick in the thorps. Something was moving under Tom's desk. It was Shanky, so Tom picked up the Rhinal and held him on his lap, absent-mindedly tapping out a tune on his head. "Well," Raikishi looked concerned, "we've done all the kicking we can. It didn't work, so we figured she needs a hacked instead." Tom's Pezrin was still spotty in parts, so he gave it his best guess. "A mentor?" "Aha!" Raikishi nodded brightly, swinging her feet beneath her. "She's a great scout, but she needs someone to teach her how to get her shit together." "Great! Want me to find you one? I can put the word out." No. Raikishi put a hand up. "We selected you." "Oh, I see." Tom's mind raced. His life had just gotten a lot more complicated. But he knew Pezrin. He didn't really have a way to say no. He sat there, staring into space as Shanky nibbled on his fingers. "That's a hell of an honor. Let me talk to my wife." "Sure thing." Raikishi hopped up, swinging her aside in an amused way as she looked around the room. "By the way, you gonna eat that Rhinal?" "Yeah!" Shanky yelled indignantly. While the Rhinal held Tom's attention, the vid he'd been watching was overridden by a news alert. Tom took a quick look at the bulletin and nearly had a heart attack. The home fleet was returning. His mind swam with new work opportunities. Horny sailors always had some skeletons in the closet, especially officers. "The Palace is pleased to announce word from Space Traffic Control, heralding the return of significant elements of home fleet. Our beloved Empress is committed to preserving our sovereignty and remains away on deployment along the Alliance border. For now, Princess Camaldry and her brother, Prince Laurel, have returned in her stead, bringing her best wishes for a bountiful Ifrovi. This momentous occasion marks a significant event in our Imperium's history. The return of Home Fleet symbolizes her dedication to safeguarding our interests and maintaining peace and security. In the Empress's absence, a grand reception and ceremonial events are planned to welcome the Princess Camaldry home. Comprehensive information can be found on the data link attached. We encourage all citizens to join in celebrating this moment of national pride and unity. Even as we do, the palace also asks that Prince Laurel and his wife be granted the peace and isolation they need in their time of grief. During this celebration, Let us come together. As one empire, demonstrating our unwavering support, our thoughts go out to Her Imperial Majesty as she carries out her... Jama switched off the announcement and scowled at the monitor. There was never anything worth watching on the thing that was nay outdone by a good novel, but the news was the news, and he flipped through the information on the data link. And what news that was. Only half of Home Fleet was back in the system. Half. Certainly it was a relief to countless families during the holiday, as husbands and sons welcomed back their loved ones. But the other half was being deployed by the Empress's hand, and would nae be home any time soon. Oh aye, the Empress returned her daughter and son, along with a fair bit of the court, to help celebrate Ifrovi. The time of mourning was past, but what time were they entering now? Jama pursed his lips as he pondered the report, reading between the lines. The Empress had found her daughter's remains, at least what would serve for symbolic burial, and that would happen when she returned, but that time was not now. Her Majesty had set the fleet on the grim task of scouring the area of debris spread across the system to leave no daughter behind, and the fleet had brought them home. Her Majesty would nae return home with her child, leaving others to mourn empty-handed. It was nae her style. And having done that, if you cut through all the conciliatory Turok shit, Kamalesh was deploying Home Fleet along the Alliance border to wipe every pirate, privateer, and unregistered military asset out of her sky. The woman's blood was up, and by the goddess she'd make the stars bleed. That was very much her style. Sending back the court had been a kind gesture, though it would have consequences. Princess Camordry was back. The useless tit was probably planning a party, and while that had its time and place during Ifrovi, the lass's habits had little to do with affairs of state. Camordry wanted to be loved, or at least a measure of public adoration, but the sad truth was there was little about her that was lovable. She observed the proper forms duty required, but there was a streak of narcissism about her that showed around the edges. An indolence that seemed to put self beside service, and possibly before it. As for Prince Laral, he'd always been comfortable providing his mother support, but he'd removed himself from the spotlight of public life to raise a family. Only the death of his sister had taken him from them, and he'd returned to the worst news any father could imagine. There would be no Ifrovi for the lad, no welcome home from Lady Orlea, no loving embrace from his youngest daughter. Laral would only have learned of their deaths when the fleet returned, and surely all of Shil would weep with him. Love and loss, triumph and tragedy, redemption and revenge. It would be a bittersweet Ifrovi, and Jama wondered what it all might mean for Princess Kalira. The lass was probably wandering the halls of the palace. Not yet out in the public, she'd been trapped by custom and circumstance, though Ganya probably knew more. He'd wagered the lass was studying at the academy, though with the holiday break, she'd be alone. Ah well, so much for the news. It was nae his affair. Jama reopened his game of Civilization 7 and reviewed his forces. His Spanish had marched up from South America, retaken Mexico, and demolished the American menace. Marines had crushed the partisans around Denver and secured his final hold on the continent. The war had never been popular with the other AI forces, but with the American AI subdued, the only real contender left was the Chinese. Soon he'd rule all of Earth with a military victory, though a cultural win was always preferable. It really was ironic. For all that Tom insisted that humans wanted peace, they had an innate talent for war. Even this game he'd borrowed from Tom was proof enough. Humans dreamed of Imperium, as long as it was on terms they enjoyed. It was clear Warwick had been loath to lend the game over. The lad tried to show the best of his world, and it troubled him greatly when inconvenient truths reared their head. The only real shame was the lad missed the truth. One day at a time, it was Tom himself, as was showing the best of humanity. People lose themselves in crowds and congregations. Well, I'll take him out for a dinner he will never get. It would be a good Efrovi, at least for most.